Welcome everyone. Very pleased to have so many of you here with us today for Biochar, the third session of This is CDR, an online event series presented by OpenAir to explore the wide range of carbon dioxide removal solutions currently being researched, developed, and deployed, and to contextualize them for a policy proposal OpenAir is working on for New York and other states and jurisdictions. Everyone, please, some of you have already started, but please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and tell us where you're zooming in from. I'm Toby Bryce, based in Brooklyn, New York, and I work on CDR policy advocacy with OpenAir. Quick background on OpenAir: we're a distributed volunteer network dedicated to the advancement of the carbon dioxide removal solutions essential to solving the climate crisis. Our growing global community collaborates on shared open source missions in the areas of research and development, policy advocacy, and activist market development. Please check out the link in the chat, and I would love to have you join our group. Most of you are familiar with carbon dioxide removal, the practice of capturing CO2 from the atmosphere and storing it safely and for a long period of time in the geosphere, the ocean, or in long-lived products. When considering CDR as we are today and with this series, it is essential, first and foremost, to emphasize that CDR is not in any way an alternative to reducing emissions. We must reduce global emissions and decarbonize our economy as quickly and as completely as possible, full stop. That said, every credible climate forecast, including most recently and in very stark terms, the IPCC report that came out last week, indicate that CDR will be required at gigaton scale, that's billions of tons per year, by mid-century to counteract the emissions that are difficult or inequitable to abate, and ultimately to start removing the tremendous excess of CO2 already in the atmosphere so that we can restore our climate to a safer and healthier state. We're not yet at megaton scale, meaning thousands of tons, millions of tons, so we need all hands on deck to start scaling CDR today. If you're new to CDR, our first two episodes from This is CDR are a great place to start. We'll put a link to our YouTube channel in the chat, and both of those episodes are available for viewing there, as will this one be, starting either later today or tomorrow. Also, we'll put a link to the CDR primer in the chat, which is a great comprehensive overview of CDR that is a great place to kind of start if you want to learn more about the topic. And of course, we're here today to learn more, and we'll be continuing these sessions weekly through the fall. Now, please meet my OpenAir colleague, Megha, who will introduce today's speaker.
Hi, everyone. I'm Megha Raghavan, based in London. I also work on OpenAir's CDR policy advocacy team, but with a particular interest in the policy opportunities in California, where I am from. So this week, we're very happy to welcome Kathleen Draper from the International Biochar Initiative to introduce us to biochar as a CDR solution, and to discuss its many uses, co-benefits, and scale potential. A couple of notes on the format. So we're going to start with a 15 to 20-minute presentation that will be followed by a few prepared questions, and then we'll do some moderated audience Q&A. So if you do have any questions as Kathleen is presenting, please go ahead and type them into Zoom's Q&A box. That's different from the chat box, so make sure you find the one that says Q&A. The event is being recorded, so we'll send that video link out to everyone who registered. It'll also be on our website, OpenAir's website, as well as our YouTube channel. And now for the main event. So Kathleen Draper is the board chair of the International Biochar Initiative, as well as the US director for the Ithaka Institute for Carbon Intelligence, which is a nonprofit open source organization focused on the use of biochar in climate farming and agroforestry, as well as other industrial uses. She is the co-author of Burn, Using Fire to Cool the Earth, and TerraPreta, How the World's Most Fertile Soil Can Help Reverse Climate Change and Reduce World Hunger. She has a master's degree in managing forest sustainability. Kathleen, over to you.
Thanks very much, and thank you to OpenAir for the invitation to talk about something I'm obviously pretty passionate about. So they provided some context for what they would like me to talk about. So that's what's driving the agenda. I will say that 15 to 20 minutes is incredibly short amount of time to get to most of this. So there's going to be some information on the slides that I'm just not going to cover, but I thought I would leave it there for future reference. So mostly what I want to talk about is to contextualize what biochar is, and importantly, what it is not. What are some of the recent market drivers pushing biochar these days, what some of the markets are. And since this is supposed to be a New York State specific thing, I'll talk a little bit about the emissions impact and what some of the current and future activities are on the biochar front. And if I have time, I'll touch on some of the co-benefits and barriers to scale. Just to clear up any of what I call carbon cousin confusion, I thought I'd spend a few minutes outlining some of the differences between biochar and its more commonly known carbon cousins, charcoal and activated carbon, also sometimes called activated charcoal. There are a few key points outlined in this chart that address the differences, but for now, I'll cover just two: what it's made from and how it's used. Charcoal is generally made from hardwoods or sawdust, and it's used to create energy in the form of heat or cooking. Activated carbon or charcoal is often made from fossil fuel sources, though it can be made from hard biomass such as coconut shells. It's traditionally been used for filtration, remediation, and as a binder if you happen to ingest something toxic and get sent to the hospital. Biochar, on the other hand, can be made from a much wider range of organic material, including wood waste, food waste, manure, sewage sludge, and even seaweed. It cannot, however, be made by heating tires, plastic waste, or municipal solid waste in high heat, low oxygen environments. It's used in an increasing number of ways, which I'll touch on shortly, but by definition, it has to be used in a way that prevents the carbon from converting back into carbon dioxide and returning to the atmosphere. This is where charcoal and biochar part ways. Several things have conspired over the past few years to help kick the interest in biochar into a much higher gear. First and foremost, I would point to the IPCC's 2018 special report, which for the first time highlighted the necessity for negative emissions technologies. They mentioned biochar specifically as one of the few negative emissions technologies with significant potential. Their recent sixth assessment made this argument even more clearly. Since the 2018 report, we've seen biochar debut on 2 and soon to be 3 carbon marketplaces. Puro was the first, and they were recently bought by NASDAQ. Carbon Future came out with a blockchain biochar-based protocol, and Vera, or VCS, will have theirs rolled out by the end of this year. The Climate Action Reserve is coming out with their own biochar protocol in 2022. Right now, demand for biochar-based carbon removal credits is strong and growing due to its durability and co-benefits. An increasing number of large companies are committing to science-based targets, which means they must reduce first and foremost, but for anything that cannot reduce, they may need to purchase removal credits. We're seeing the likes of Microsoft, Shopify, and Spotify purchasing biochar-based credits for the first time this year. It's pretty exciting. This infographic was my attempt about 5 years ago to assess the various biochar markets in terms of the size of the market, the readiness, the potential pricing for the biochar in each of these markets. Things have changed substantially since then, but it's still helpful to understand the variability of different markets. Up in the top left, I've added some of the newer markets for biochar. Almost the entire focus on research and commercial activity for the first decade of biochar's life was on its use in soils. The value proposition to farmers was challenging, especially as the product was expensive and results are variable depending on the type of biochar, soils, crops, and other variables. It really only made sense with high value crops or where the farmer faced significant growing challenges and costs. With production ramping up and prices going down, and with programs such as the USDA NRCS Soil Carbon Amendment Protocol, I think we'll finally start to see more adoption from farmers. In the meantime, other markets have been developing in parallel, but we'll have to save that for the Q&A period if folks are interested in that sort of thing. One question that is increasingly being asked is, what kind of impact can biochar have on overall greenhouse gas emissions? You'll find different answers from different sources. The recent sixth assessment by the IPCC put the figure at 1.1 gigatons. Project Drawdown recently upped their original estimate to between 2.2 and 4.2 gigatons. But both of these ignore potential feedstocks such as sewage sludge, manures, and seaweed. Both look almost exclusively at biochar's use in soils, and both only look at the carbon sequestration and ignore some pretty significant greenhouse gas reductions that result from the use of biochar in different scenarios. The truth is, we need to do a better job in crunching these numbers. One of the best calculations I've seen came out of China earlier this year. Lead author Qing Yang concluded that national deployment could contribute up to 68% reduction of carbon emissions per unit of GDP in 2030 compared to 2005, if biochar was widely adapted in China. This is the sort of work New York State and all states and all countries, frankly, need to focus on to answer this critical question with any degree of accuracy. To start answering that question, you need to understand what our current and targeted emissions are, which you can see here for New York State. Then we need to understand available and accessible biomass. RIT and the Pollution Prevention Institute have started this work, which is reflected on this graphic on the lower left. Then we need to do the carbon math for each type of feedstock, not only on the removals, but also on the reduction side. A related question that I'm often asked is, exactly how carbon negative is biochar production? My answer is always, it depends on a lot of different variables. The type of feedstock used is the biggest differentiator. While woody biochar can have up to 95% carbon content, sludge and manures could be in the 5 to 35%, depending on heating temperatures during production. And that also influences how much biochar you get. The type of production technology is also a critical factor. Gasification may only net between 5 and 15% biochar by yield, whereas pyrolysis could be 25% or more. Then any emissions related to feedstock acquisition and biochar production must be accounted for in the overall carbon efficiency calculations. A simple conversion without any of this factored in is the 3.67 multiplier to convert carbon into carbon dioxide. But a truer conversion factor is likely in the 2.0 to 3.0 range, meaning for every dry ton of biochar produced, you could sequester between 2 and 3 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. New York State is, sad to say, not a leader when it comes to biochar commercially, though hopefully this will change. The Europeans and the Chinese are far ahead of the US, in my opinion, and within the US, there's a lot more biochar activity over on the West Coast. On the academic side, however, we do have some top-notch biochar researchers, not the least of which can be found at our land-grant university, Cornell. Johannes Lehmann and his team have been doing world-class research for more than a dozen years, mostly focusing on its use in soils, but they also deserve a lot of credit for influencing the IPCC's perspective on biochar and carbon sequestration. Most recently, NYSERDA provided funding to Cornell to put the first pyrolysis machine on a dairy for demonstration purposes. And this follows on from funding they received a few years ago from the US Dairy Innovation Center to create a white paper on the benefits of biochar production on dairy farms. Cornell Cooperative Extension is starting to promote biochar, but mostly from what I've seen and heard, that's out on Long Island, with thanks to Debbie Aller. For fielding any and all biochar related questions from farmers across the state. She has created some really nice biochar reference materials, which you can find on the website I've linked to here. And she is planning on hosting a field day sometime this fall. So I would recommend that you check back at this site for future information on that. Oops, sorry. The Rochester Institute of Technology has been working with biochar for several years, focusing mostly on turning food waste into biochar as an alternative to other organic management practices. And they've also done research on using it to filter effluent from food processing plants. It's used in anaerobic digesters, in printer inks, and in composite materials such as agricultural mulch and packaging. SUNY ESF is involved with biochar from a policy perspective. Tristan Brown has put in substantial effort to ensure that thermal processing used to make biochar is covered in New York's CLCPA language. This is significant as the way it was originally written, it was excluded. Also, ESF hopes to host a biochar demonstration facility in Syracuse and will be hosting a biochar event later this year as part of an annual biochar series started a few years ago at Cornell. which was hosted last year virtually by RIT. The purpose of these events is to educate policymakers about different aspects of biochar research and commercial activities. Several other universities are ramping up research on different aspects of biochar or biochar production. I've listed a few here. I'm sure there are more. One thing I will say that I find really interesting and that gives me a lot of hope is the number of students that are taking it upon themselves to do their own independent biochar research. I recently found out about a master's student at the University of Albany who has created a survey to gauge interest and knowledge about biochar from farmers, and that was sent out via the whole extension network. So we'll see what that turns up. As I mentioned already, the current commercial activities in New York State are quite small, but the pipeline is building as it is across the country and really across the globe. I've been involved in biochar research, education, and consulting for about a decade under the banner of Finger Lakes Biochar. Some of this is with some of the universities I mentioned, Cornell, RIT, and the University of Rochester. I've also written some white papers and even co-authored a few books, as they mentioned. More recently, I and 4 fellow co-founders launched Centrist, which is a biomaterials company. And a few months ago, we received funding from New York State's Fuse Hub to further our prototyping of biochar-based thermal packaging for vaccines and food. And we're also developing an enhanced drywall made from biochar and other low carbon materials. Apart from my own biochar activities, I believe New York State is now home to 2 Tiger Cat carbonizers, which you can see pictured here, one of which is owned and operated by Brothers Landscaping, and I believe the other is a vineyard, though I'm a little vague on those details. So if you have a giant pile of debris, the landscaping company will bring this machine to you and turn it into biochar. You don't get the highest yield from this machine, nor is it easy to use the heat, but these are generally used in situations where you're either going to burn the biomass completely or you're going to chip it and ship it to a landfill, which is much more expensive, not to mention it emits significantly more greenhouse gas emissions. Sorry, I forgot to mention, Seneca Farms Biochar is the first industrial scale producer of biochar in New York State, though they're still in the scaling up phase for their new state-of-the-art flatbed pyrolysis reactor. At full scale, this first plant will be capable of generating between 1 and 2 truckloads per day, and their subsequent plants are likely to be much larger than that. The future for biochar commercially in New York State is looking better and better. While I don't pretend to know everything that's going on related to biochar within the state, I'm going to provide 3 examples that I think are showing a lot of promise. Advanced Resilient Biocarbon is headquartered in Cold Springs, New York, and they've signed multiple joint ventures with waste operators and large-scale farmers to set up carbonization refineries, one of which is a very large dairy with about 5,000 or more cows. And they plan to convert dairy manure into biochar, wood vinegar, and other low carbon or carbon sequestering materials. The Long Island Energy and Infrastructure Development Group has been working behind the scenes for several years now to set up a demonstration plant out on Long Island that will showcase different biochar production technologies, the first of which is a small scale gasifier from All Power Labs, and that's being permitted now. And they are also working with Stony Brook University on using biochar to clean up some of the polluted waters in Long Island. Northeastern Biochar Solutions is one of the newer biochar companies I've come across, but they are already in the site planning phase for a large facility in Saratoga County that will convert sewage sludge and biosolids into biochar. This is an area that I believe has huge potential to not only sequester carbon, but it can significantly reduce methane and other emissions that result from landfilling or land application of biosolids. And they hope to be operational by the end of 22, I believe. Although all eyes are increasingly focusing on the carbon impact of biochar and other CDR solutions, it's important to take a more holistic perspective and understand what additional environmental impacts, both positive and negatives, these solutions might have Fortunately, biochar brings with it a plethora of co-benefits, some of which I've outlined here. And again, if you have questions, we can cover that in the Q&A. So all new industries face substantial barriers, and biochar is no different. First and foremost, I would say the biggest barrier is awareness. I used to say that 99.9% of the people I spoke to had never heard of biochar. And while that number is decreasing, it's probably still in the 95+% range, unless the audience happens to be in the climate space. So we need to really ramp up education for all sectors and all potential stakeholders. That's students, that's academics, that's DEC, that's everybody. The other thing that we really need to focus on is large scale markets. The technology to make biochar exists in many forms and in many scales. The biochar exists in many different forms, and the funding is starting to come through. Developing markets is critical to helping the industry scale, especially since you won't be able to tap into the carbon markets until or unless you can prove that you've sold your biochar to someone that isn't using it as a heating source, which is a much easier market these days, especially as the steel and cement industries are looking to shift away from coal and other fossil fuels. The other barrier is permitting. I've been told that it can take quite a long time, a year or more, to get a plant up and running. It's obviously time consuming and painful and costly. So if we are to scale biochar quickly, we need to streamline this process and get the policy folks up to speed on the different types of carbonization technologies and their emissions. And lastly, we need to see a wider variety of financing options and business models developed and shared. There are a growing number of options, but very often these are closely held, or funders are so new to biochar that they really don't know some of the best questions to ask in terms of getting them comfortable with funding biochar. I'll leave it to OpenAir to discuss more on the policy side, but here's just a few things that some I've mentioned already. The CLCPA, there are some recommendations now to specifically include thermochemical conversion technology. That's not a slam dunk, but we should know in the next month or two if that's actually going to happen. If so, I think that changes the game here in New York. Some of the current biochar protocols exclude giving carbon removal credits for things like manure and sludge. I think we need to change that because of not only the carbon sequestration, but some of the ancillary benefits I mentioned previously. In some places, there is a bio-preferred program. We'd like to see that extended to include low-embodied carbon preferential purchasing policies. And the other thing that I didn't have time to mention on the markets, one of the biggest markets for biochar in Europe anyway, is putting it in animal feed. And there's many different benefits to doing this, but it is currently not on the approved list of substances by the FDA. California, however, has made an exception to this, and I think we need to see New York do the same, and preferably have the federal folks adopt that language. I will say under the Biden administration, there is a huge amount of interest in biochar, especially compared to the previous administration. And we do know that there's been a carve out of $200 million in the current infrastructure bill that would specifically go towards converting forestry residues into biochar. So it's all very promising from my perspective. And with that, I think I'll turn it over to questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kathleen. That is super interesting. And I know that there's so much to cover and that you only, it was a very short window of time. So, but that was really fantastic. Couple questions. I wanted to one thing I find really interesting about biochar is the actual nature of the pyrolysis reaction. And I know you kind of alluded to it when you were running through the slides, but can you speak to how the sort of the exothermic nature of the reaction and how that relates to LCA for biochar? Because that's one thing I didn't understand initially that I think is pretty cool.
Okay, I'm not an engineer,
okay.
But So gasification and pyrolysis are the most commonly used ways to carbonize material. They each have different co-products, and one has a little bit of oxygen introduced to it, that's gasification, and one has basically no oxygen. So on the pyrolysis side, it's really geared towards maximizing biochar as your product. Gasification is really more of an energy play with this black stuff that comes out. We've seen a lot of those gasification companies or operators starting to focus more on biochar production. And so now they're retrofitting some of the existing equipment to shift from, say, 5% biochar to 15% biochar. And the carbon efficiency, there are these different protocols that I mentioned, Puro, Carbon Future, and now VCS, and they actually go in and look at the emissions related to the machinery. So that's all measured, and then that's discounted from, you know, the 3.67
Right.
to get to a specific number for a specific plant using a specific feedstock. So that's how that works.
And the actual pyrolysis reaction is exothermic, meaning it kind of feeds itself energetically. So it doesn't require sustained input of electricity, which is pretty interesting.
Some of them may need it in the beginning to get it up to temperature, but most of them have excess heat, especially if you're using a dry biomass. And that excess heat ideally is used in district heating systems or drying feedstock or other things. Got it.
Very cool. Speaking of the feedstock, I feel like a key question to scaling all biomass-based CDR solutions is the idea that as these different solutions scale, whether it's like a bio-oil from Charm Industrial or any sort of Bikers or Bex process or biochar, that eventually waste biomass could become scarce and a limiting factor to scaling. Do you see that as an issue for biochar, or do you feel like there's a wide enough range of waste biomass feedstock that will not limit the scaling potential?
I would love to see that happen, but we're a far cry from seeing that. But what I will say is I just finished doing an interesting project with 4 different cities, 2 in the US and 2 in Europe. And there is this competition for some of that resource. Already in Europe, you'll see district heating systems that use that woody biomass. There's incinerators that have long-term contracts for sewage sludge and things like that. So we are going to have to, you know, understand what is actually available versus just out there and what the best use of it is. Because there's already a lot of sunk infrastructure in some of these incineration plants that they're not going to just turn those off.
Yeah. A question that we asked last week as well at our enhanced rock weathering rock dust as a soil amendment session. There's a lot of debate out there about nature-based versus engineered, and we can put this in the chat, but a really great recent paper by Shannon Ithaka, Rob Bellamy, and Noel Castry entitled Framing Nature-Based Solutions to Climate Change. Their thesis was basically that this nature-based versus engineered is not a useful distinction to make, particularly in a case like biochar, which is nature-based but also engineered, and that we would be much better off if we could kind of move beyond that and really focus on the actual characteristics of the process in terms of LCA, co-benefit, potential harms, scale potential, cost, et cetera. Do you have any comment on that, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, we always describe biochar as a kind of hybrid because, you know, the actual biochar, when it's used in nature, is a nature-based solution, but the technologies are very often industrial scale. And so it is a technical solution, but you know, now we're seeing a blurring of the lines in terms of using it in concrete and asphalt. And I wouldn't necessarily call that a nature-based solution. So it is very difficult to apply that to biochar.
One last question about commercialization. In terms of, there are a lot of interesting CDR quote unquote startups out there. There are not really that many that are focused on biochar per se. There's Carboculture out of Finland. And most of, you know, when I look at your Twitter or your LinkedIn feeds, which are amazing because you're always highlighting these really cool projects all over the world, everything seems to be kind of organic and small scale in terms of how the biochar industry is developing. Do you see that as the future of commercialization, or do you think that there will be big, like regional, national, multinational companies built around biochar? Like, how do you see commercialization and scaling of biochar playing out?
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff under the surface that is happening, and it is much larger scale than what currently exists. But I think what's preventing that from happening is figuring out the markets. I mean, it's all very exciting to see how much biochar is getting on the carbon removal markets, and that's significant money. But until we have some more offtake agreements or large scale markets, I think people are hesitating.
And is this markets for the carbon credits or for the actual biochar product, or both?
The biochar product. The demand is outpacing supply on the carbon finance side, from what I hear.
Yeah.
But you cannot get those until you've actually sold the biochar, and you have to prove that it's not being sold to a steel company to burn in their process.
And what is in terms of commercialization, do you see the scale happening with someone like Carboculture, who's doing CDR and biochar production as a service for folks that create a lot of biomass waste biomass, or do you see it on the sewage treatment or dairy, or where do you think the most scale potential is?
I think sewage sludge is going to go fast when we actually have a few projects up and running. The biggest one that I know of right now is Aries Clean Technology. They've been building the plant in Linden, New Jersey. It should be up and running this year. They've had a lot of COVID related delays, but they're taking in 440 tons per day of sewage sludge, churning out a very low carbon char, about 5 tons per day. And the hope is that that'll go to displace fly ash from a local concrete company. That's a great model. The company that I mentioned in New York is looking at reduction of PFAS and PFOS and putting it back in the soil. I think that's a great model if we can get farmers comfortable with that. And once we can prove that, I think you're going to see that all over the place, because it makes the waste processing so much more efficient, and you can utilize the nitrogen and phosphorus hopefully in the right process. So I think that's going to be one of the first ones we see, because it's so much more than just carbon sequestration.
Yeah. Got it.
Yeah, but I've talked to probably every week I talk to somebody that's in the middle of planning new plants that are going to be churning out thousands of tons of biochar. So I think what you're seeing now in the market is nothing compared to what we're going to see a year or two from now.
That's great. Very cool. Well, we literally have dozens of questions in the chat and the Q&A, and I'm going to flip it over to Megha to kind of process a few of those and send them your way, Kathleen, if that's okay.
Sure.
Yeah, so we have tons of questions. I'm going to do my best to try to get the ones that have been asked a few times and seems like a bunch of people are interested in. So first of all, could you just talk a little bit about, how much biochar can actually increase soil productivity, what crops benefit most from it, and kind of where that end product goes?
Yep. So disclosure, not an agronomist either. And it is super variable. Where I see it making the most impact right now is in places like California, where you pay a lot for water, and biochar can really help with water management in soils. A lot of people would like to see it proven economically on corn and soybean, because that's where we have the most acreage. But until that price point is a lot lower than it is right now, I don't think the economics are there. Over the long term they were, but farmers work on a year-to-year basis. But again, for me, it's what are you trying to solve? What are your growing constraints? We're also seeing more in the developing world, but also China, where they have a lot of toxic soils from poor waste management practices, that biochar can immobilize some of those toxins, which is really key. The example I always give is in Peru with cacao, which you use to make chocolate. The farmers had all lost the European market because of increased regulations related to cadmium levels. But they found that you could use a small amount of biochar every year on existing trees around the drip line to help immobilize the cadmium, and it worked to an extent that they're below the threshold now, so they can reinstate that. So for me, those are the ones that I would be going for first.
Got it. Very cool. Okay, another question was, which biochar solution, in your opinion, has the potential to be the most rapidly adopted, and which might be particularly suitable to community co-ownership, profit sharing, cooperatives, et cetera, to help with a just transition and equity-focused local development in areas experiencing rural decline in the Northern Hemisphere? So
that's a big question. Yeah, I have a hard time answering that. I get asked that a lot by venture capitalists. And I think you need somebody who's got a better engineering background. I tend to focus more on the biochar itself. But I don't think there is one solution. I think there are many solutions at many scales. And this is what I love about biochar. You know, I'm going down to Colombia in a couple of weeks to work with coffee farmers, and we're going to carbonize their coffee tree stumps and turn it into biochar in a way that's affordable to them. And then we're going to run their milling effluent through it to charge it. And then we're going to use that as fertilizer. To me, that's got, you know, social justice all over. You're increasing farmer livelihoods, you're improving water quality, you're decreasing the cost of fertilizer and the emissions. So, and then it works more at industrial scales, but we're still trying to create those economically. But there's many options out there.
Yeah, maybe as a similar follow-up question, someone asked, is there a potential for small-scale distributed biochar that can add up to a substantial impact, or do you see it a bit more centralized?
So my thesis in my master's was that very question.
Okay.
And I came out thinking, oh, I'm so naive. But I'm actually working on this coffee project. And what's so interesting about it is if you have an aggregator, and my client is, you know, they're very tied into each of their thousands of coffee producers. I think when you can validate it at that scale and yet aggregate it, I think it's going to have a material impact. I haven't seen it so much on, you know, community scale in the US yet. I think what we see in the Stockholm biochar model, where they're, you know, starting to carbonize all sorts of green waste, putting it into the district heating system and using it for stormwater management. I think that's a great model that the Bloomberg Philanthropies Foundation is really starting to help replicate. They've got funding behind it. They've put resources behind it. I mean, there's a lot that can be replicated, but we're still kind of in the early days.
Makes sense. A couple of people asked about just other applications for it. So I know you mentioned, you know, general agriculture and absorbing certain poisons. So some of the questions were, are there any applications for using biochar for adaptation after, for example, heavy rainfalls, flooding, or to clean soils from chemical flame retardants, et cetera? What do you think about those kinds of potential applications?
Yeah, so one of my favorite ones right now is I have blogged about this late last year, and it's actually been prototyped now, where they're using it to cap abandoned oil wells and to clean up the you know, I don't know how big the circumference is around them, but to remediate all the toxins in them. So not only is it going to help reduce the methane being emitted by those abandoned wells, of which there are 3 million in this country alone, but it is helping to remediate the toxins in the environment. Yeah, I think we're going to start to see that more and more because there's a lot of cleanup to do. The other thing I will say is, here's my biochar wall. I think you can see it over here. This is a plaster wall that I put about 10 pounds of biochar in. It has, you know, fireproofing, it has humidity control, it has all sorts of benefits to doing that sort of thing. And there's lots of people interested in doing that, but it's more on a DIY basis so far that I've seen, not terribly commercialized.
Right, okay. A few people had questions a bit more about the chemical process, I guess. So I'll just read out a few. So how much bio oil and syngas are produced during the process and what's done with them? Yeah, go ahead.
Just to answer that, again, that varies by the technology. Syngas, I believe, is most often recirculated back into the machine to help keep the heat up and things like that. Bio oil is as diverse as biochar is right now. Some people are getting much more sophisticated with their bio oil and turning it into usable fuels. I'm not an expert in that, but I know there's a lot of interest in that. But even if you, and I'm not recommending this, you inject that back down into the oil wells, old wells, that's a way of you know, carbon sequestration. I think there's better uses for it, but
okay.
Some systems are actually turning, say, manure into jet fuel and biochar. But again, it really varies by your feedstock and your technology as to what the properties of that biochar oil are and what the potential uses are.
Great. We got a couple of questions about permanence and scale, which I'll put together. So how do we know that it's permanent, or how do you think about that? And then I know you talked a bit about scale and some of the barriers, but maybe you could talk about like, what do you see as the biggest or the most significant or worrying thing standing in the way?
So permanence is measured by something called the HC ratio. And to be considered biochar, the ratio has to be below 0.7. And that's been kind of shown in science to be one of the best indicators of permanence or longevity. So, if you were to take a piece of wood, I don't know what the HC ratio is, but it's well above 0.7. If you were to cook it at a temperature of, say, 200 degrees, it's still probably not going to be considered real carbon, long-lasting carbon, I should say. But the higher the temperature goes, the lower that ratio is, and the more long-lasting that biochar will be, as long as you're not, burning it up. But the longevity can be anywhere between decades to millennia, and it kind of rests on where you've put it and what that HC ratio is.
Great. Okay, cool. So I think maybe moving over from some of the more technical chemical questions into sort of implementation and policy and commercialization. So a bunch of people in the open air community I know are focused on thinking about the intersection of negative emissions and concrete. And they're advocating, for support policies in different states, New York being one of them. And we recently found out about biochar as a substitute for Portland cement. Are you familiar with those developments, and any thoughts you want to share on those?
Yes, I have several samples in my office about that sort of thing. I've done a lot of stuff. Here's some that is actually not replacing concrete, but gypsum in drywall. But yeah, it's the first commercial example that I saw. There's been a lot of DIY of that, is over in Sweden. A company called Snöhetta is putting, they're not saying how much biochar is in it, but it is at least at the carbon neutral, if not carbon negative stage. And the amount of biochar that you can put in there kind of depends on what the end utility is of the concrete. So I've done projects with students where we were putting it in roof tiles, and that's a different thing from putting it in a structure that needs to support things. So again, it depends on what the end use is and the dictated properties of that particular end use as to how much biochar you can put in. Usually it's not a huge amount, maybe 2 to 5%, but there are some situations. I know a guy who's put them in cinder blocks up to 70%. So yeah, the sky's the limit when I hear that. And then on the asphalt side, I think that's even more promising. Although there are some policy hurdles we have to get over. There's a company in Australia that's working with the city of Perth to put it in their asphalt and below the asphalt. So they said they can put up to 30 tons per kilometer of road in the cold mix asphalt and up to 300 tons in the substrate below that, which is phenomenal. And you can also use a lower quality, which is in air quotes, biochar for that. Something from sewage sludge is probably fine.
Right. Yeah, and in terms of policy, how do you think about the communication side of this? Because I think there's a lot of nuance around communicating the subject and explaining what is biochar versus some of the other solutions. How do you think about communicating the value of biochar without confusing people that we're talking about something like waste incineration or CCS or some other similar things?
Yeah, there is a lot of confusion when it comes to burning in different ways. I think, that's just all about educating people on emissions, because even old gasification plants weren't necessarily known for being terribly efficient from an emissions perspective, but things have come a long way. And there's all sorts of specific technology LCAs out there that can show what the emissions are for carbonizing a certain kind of biomass. And we just need to be a lot more transparent about that sort of thing.
Makes a lot of sense. And are there any best practices in terms of spreading knowledge, getting people to understand it, since it seems to be a pretty big issue for scaling it up more?
I wish I knew. I'm not sure I have that answer. But if anybody on this call has some suggestions, let me know. I mean, I think the International Biochar Initiative is really trying to figure that out. And yeah, we're in the process of hiring some people that can help us to do that. But, you know, there's just so many stakeholders out there right now that want an opinion, and we're still very much in the learning curve. So
Right.
Whenever I get asked these things, I'm a little hesitant to say, well, this is the best case, because there's always a new one on the horizon that we haven't heard about yet.
Yeah, fair enough. A couple of people asked about sort of different countries, so differences between how biochar is developing as an industry in the US and in Europe. Someone asked about China. Do you have any context on how it's developing elsewhere?
Yeah, well, so China's a little bit hard to nail down, although I've been there 3 times, and every time I go there, I'm amazed at how quickly they're learning and adapting their technology. It is industrial scale, and they are really putting a lot of effort into it. I think COVID put a lot of that on pause, but I just heard we have a board member from China on the IBI board, and I was just hearing from him recently that, you know, things are going really well there. What that means in terms of amounts, you know, if they're making 500,000 tons per year of biochar, I'd be happy. Is anybody tracing that? I don't know. IBI just got funding this year, and one of our high priorities after we hire an executive director is to go out and do a broad market assessment. We haven't done one for 6 years, and the market has changed substantially, but everybody asks that question, and we're really interested in figuring out.
Yeah, cool. I think that's an interesting one, because I feel like a lot of people think of biochar as this kind of, you know, ancient process that's been around for millennia even. Are there a lot of big innovations and kind of patents and things happening in that space?
Yes, probably too many patents. In fact, years ago, I wrote a blog about patent sitting, because there were some patents that were just so broad, it was causing a lot of angst in the biochar community, especially if people were patenting something that, you know, indigenous communities figured out centuries ago. But yeah, there's all sorts of new technology innovations. There's new uses of biochar that we're starting to see a lot more patents come out on. But, you know, I think we need that in order for investors to get comfortable with funding those sorts of things. So much as I was against patents.
Excited about?
Yeah. Oh, what did you say?
Just any innovations you're most excited about?
Yes, the ones I'm currently working on myself. But there's a lot of fascinating things that I come across that and we wrote about a lot of them in Bern. It's just an exciting space to be in right now.
Fantastic. Well, we're kind of heading toward the end of our time. So wanted to thank you. Kathleen, before we wrap, do you want to, your email's up on the screen, do you want to kind of tell people what the International Biochar Initiative is, and if people are interested, how they might want to or could get involved?
Oh, thank you for the opportunity. Yes. Yeah. So we are probably one of the oldest nonprofits supporting the biochar industry. You can become a subscriber to our monthly newsletter for free. We probably have 15,000 newsletter subscribers, or you can become a member either at a personal level, business, organizational, or sponsoring level. And yeah, as I said, we just got a very generous grant in May, and it's a capacity building grant. So we are about to announce some exciting news on that front, but I can't quite say it right now, but stay tuned.
Fantastic. We'll put your Twitter in the chat, and I'm going to go ahead and share the screen. Thank you so much, Kathleen, for joining us today. It's super interesting, and encourage everyone to follow Kathleen on social media and learn more about biochar. Our series will be continuing next week with a great presentation about ocean CDR from Ocean Visions, Dr. Catherine Jadot and Dr. David Koweek. They have great documents about the different kinds of ocean CDR pathways. And then we'll be continuing on through the fall. We have direct air capture with Dr. Habib Azarabadi on August 31st. We have a very cool presentation from Matthew Eisenman from Stony Brook University in New York about his initiative CMATE, which is electrochemical alkalinity enhancement and ocean carbon capture. And then on the 20th, we're skipping the week of the 14th because of the Jewish holidays, and also Climeworks has a really fantastic direct air capture summit that week. But then on the 21st, we have Dave Goldberg to tell us about geologic sequestration opportunities in New York State. And then in October, we have Climeworks, Charm, Project Vesta, and Running Tide that we're in the process of booking. So stay tuned and please join us. But Kathleen, wanted to thank you again for being with us today. It was super interesting, and thank everyone in the audience for joining us. Be well, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.